Hello, Arnaud. Thank you for coming to Freecone's Populaire. It is a great honor, especially since you are talking to us from very, very far away from Asia. So, Arnaud, a lot of people know you, especially in the English speaking world, but also in France. You have a lot of followers. You're a French entrepreneur. In particular, you founded House Trip, which you managed to sell to TripAdvisor in 2015. Then you moved to China and became one of the most listened to figures in the English speaking world about China and geopolitics in general, with it seems more than 100 million monthly readers on Twitter, which is absolutely colossal. And so every time you tweet, there are a lot of followers, a lot of retweeted, a lot of comments. Uh, Besides, we are here, very, very numerous of us following you at Fréquence Populaire. It's when you make a tweet, usually it's a very, very documented tweet with analyses that are rarely found elsewhere. Profound. How did you get there? Can you explain your background a bit before we get to the heart of this program today with you?
First of all, hello, Georges, and thank you very much for inviting me. All the honor is mine. Um, yes, my background is I grew up in Drôme, near the small town called Juify, for those who know. And then, um,
Nice and beautiful region.
yes, indeed, it is well worth the name. Fee, which translate in English, in God made it. And then I went to study in Switzerland at the École Hôtelière de Lausanne, and I also studied a bit in the United States at Harvard University. And during my vacation, my studies in Switzerland, I met my wife who is Chinese, so it was my first connection with China. And then we created House Trip together. Excuse me, I have a tinge of English. I speak English every day. We created a house trip together, which worked quite well. Well, it's the whole startup journey, quite typical. We had investors, capitalist ventures, as they say, VC, who invested. And then lo and behold, we went from the two of us, me and my wife, who started the business in our living room, to 250 employees. Housetrip was a platform for renting vacation apartments. So it's like Airbnb. Before Airbnb, we created the companies a year before them.
Congrats.
And then lo and behold, we sold the company finally in 2015 to TripAdvisor. And then we found ourselves at a point in our lives where we could choose a new life. And we decided to go to China because my wife and I wanted children. And then we wanted to educate them in both cultures, French culture and Chinese culture. And strangely, it was easier to do that in China than in France because there are French schools in China, but there are no Chinese schools in France. So, yeah, that was our calculation, actually. Besides, before going to China, I didn't know China that well. Well, I went there every year with my wife to see her family, but just 2 week stays like that without ever having lived in the country. And then there you go. So it was my first real experience of living in China. And I love the country for myself. It's an absolutely fascinating country with a culture so different from ours. Intellectually, it's very interesting to understand the culture, the way he sees the world, which is radically different from ours.
And at this point, I'm going to cut you off. It's important because our listeners don't know it yet, but you're going to come and do recurring programs on Fréquence Populaire and, among other things, to tell us about China, because China is this immense multi-millennial civilization, and which is, in fact, finally very little known in France, with a lot of preconceived ideas or even really very, very stupid assumptions. And you will also help us to discover and deconstruct these absurd assumptions.
Yes, I look forward to continuing to discuss this with you. Yes, Indeed, China, it has developed really apart from the rest of the world since it has always had this tendency quite to take refuge in herself. Besides, if you see behind me, there is the Great Wall of China, which is a good symbol of the Chinese tendency to always want to build walls around itself, to want to protect itself from the rest of the world, and to maintain its culture, to remain itself. And that's why, in fact, it has persisted as a culture, because she has always had this instinct to want protect herself from external influences. But also, it means that it is a country that we know very little about because it is a country that has never proselytized, for example. China has never sent Chinese Taoists or Buddhist monks to the end of the world to try to convert Westerners to their religion or things like that. On the contrary, they have always made an effort to make the rest of the world not understand them. For hundreds of years, for example, there were laws in China for example, there were laws in China which prohibited the teaching of Chinese to foreigners under death penalty. So it's more their reflex to make sure that they stay together and that we don't understand them rather than the opposite.
As a result, there is a real, almost cultural revolution in this 21st century with contemporary China. Since there are the Silk Roads, there are BRICS, there are massive investments in many countries of the world, recently in Peru, the Grand Port, in Africa. This is a real change, I imagine, compared to this situation.
You're right. China is much more open to the world, but it still has big problems explaining itself to the world, I think. We always talk about Chinese propaganda and these things. But in fact, when you watch the real Chinese propaganda made by the Chinese state media, they are really very, very bad at explaining themselves. In fact, because of this story, because of the fact that it's really not their habit, so they gossip, they quote the
I mean, they are under the influence of USA.
yes, there it is. Very, 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 very far away, even. There are light years away. So he does not help himself in that sense. And yeah, just to go back for a moment and explain how I actually got into tweeting and speaking out about China and well, honestly, it all started simply because I was living there. And the more time I spent in the country, the more obvious it became to me that there was this huge disconnect, massive gap between what people were saying about China from the outside and what I was actually seeing and experiencing on a daily basis. There were so many wild myths floating around, often based on nothing at all. It's just completely made up stuff, really. Quite simply, it annoyed me so much that I started tweeting about it and just talking about my experience in China, my daily life there, and then trying to also understand why there were these myths, who financed them, who benefited from them. So, to do more geopolitical analysis around information about China. And then one thing led to another, as I was one of the only Westerners who communicated on these topics, more and more people followed me. Um, and we got to the situation we are in.
So, if I may say so, you're a little modest because from China, but many of your positions are almost high standard journalism. We can see that there is real work. It's not just your opinion in the morning by saying, I'm going to talk about that. We are far beyond the average media analyst that we unfortunately have in France when they speak about China and Chinese society. You must spend a lot of time reading, searching, because there's really rich and dense material. It's not.
In fact, honestly, that's actually it. It's morning when I wake up after breakfast. Already during breakfast, I read the news, and then there it is. What jumps out at me, I tweet about it, and I spend maybe 1 to 2 hours in the morning to write a fairly well argued post on a subject, but it's not my main business. Far from it. I am still an entrepreneur. I have another startup. And yeah, the truth is, most of my day, like the vast majority of it, is actually dedicated to working on this company. And the Twitter business is really a hobby side. The two things are not connected at all. I never tweet about my business. So yeah, it's really just something I'm passionate about: geopolitics, China, Chinese culture. But that is not my professional activity. And maybe that's also why people like to follow me, since I don't have anything at stake. In fact, I don't make money on that. Um, I'm not particularly pressured to, uh, like maybe some journalists producing articles all the time, even if we know that it's not going to be of good quality. It's just when there's something I'm interested in. So I think that authentic side can be transparent through my tweets.
Well, listen, we're going to add you a new hobby of coming from time to time on free calls. Populaire for, well, at first mostly in French, but more and more also in English. This is going to be a space for development and exchange, a place where we'll invite you to share your thoughts, your perspectives, and tell us more about all these important topics that you explore so thoroughly and on which you provide such sharp, thoughtful, and in depth analysis. So, for this very first discussion, well, this first interview, we're going to dive into a topic that's capturing attention all over the world right now: artificial intelligence, something that fascinates people everywhere, across all fields, and raises so many questions about the future. It is a subject of geopolitical confrontation. We can see it very clearly at the moment. It is also a subject that, for many citizens, is mysterious. It seems complicated, sounds magical. Some say that there's a terrible danger that humanity could disappear. In short, there's a very, very important subject with two major global players, the United States and now China. So we're going to talk about it in. And to start, I'm going to ask you this first question: is so to what extent is artificial intelligence really a revolutionary technology? Is it truly as important and game changing as everyone says it is? Or are we maybe giving it more weight than it actually deserves? We let it be believed, or where there's communication behind it.
So I think that AI will change a lot of things. And in fact, we are already starting to see it. For example, personally, I barely use Google anymore. Now, when I want to do a search, it's still much easier to use AI. Everyone focuses on the models, how intelligent they are. If we want to get to general artificial intelligence, the IAG, I think we say in French. I think that what will matter infinitely more are the applications that come from AI. I think we should think of AI as electricity or the steam engine or the heat engine. It is a fundamental technology, but the important thing is not so much the technology itself, but what are we going to do with it? So it was not the combustion engine that mattered as such, but cars and tractors, for example. And for me, the most important question that people rarely ask themselves, but what I think is fundamental, is whether there is going to accelerate productivity. If we take the combustion engine, for example, that's a classic case of an invention that significantly boosted productivity. It made it possible to develop tractors, for instance, which obviously allowed farmers and peasants to work less physically while producing much more. So it had a massive impact on productivity. And whenever productivity increases, it usually means increase in wealth, since we are the same number of people. If you are more productive, the same number of people can produce a lot more wealth. And there's another possibility where it doesn't increase productivity, like the internet, for example. And it's a lot of people tell themselves that they are living in a time when technology is changing a lot of things. And in fact, the internet is quite paradoxically an example of the technology that still had a lot of impact on our lives, but had almost no effect on productivity. If we look at productivity in France, for example, I've been watching since the beginning of the 2000s. Our productivity gains are falling year by year. It's quite crazy when intuitively we could have said to ourselves, here's the internet, even though it's changing so much, that it's changing so much that it should give us productivity gains. Well, no, that's not the case at all.
It is really very interesting because it is completely counterintuitive and even contrary to what we are sometimes told.
Yes, I agree. It is completely counterintuitive. And when there are significant changes in society, there is a technology that does not accelerate productivity. In fact, it means that there's not really any additional wealth that's being created through this technology, but it often has the effects of redistributing wealth, as we saw with the internet and the, I don't know what we call them in French, the big tech. It usually means more wealth is created, and in many cases, it also means that certain groups manage to capture a large share of that wealth for themselves. Wealth coming from all over the world, really, but it didn't really create new wealth. That's what you have to keep in mind. So, paradoxically, in fact, there are a lot of people who say that artificial intelligence, which is very worrying, is if it replaces a lot of jobs. On the contrary, I think it would be good news if it replaces a lot of jobs, because that means it increases productivity considerably so that it creates new wealth instead of redistributing wealth. It creates abundance. People who are being replaced by AI can do other activities where a person can produce a lot more than they did before. So that's the way it should be seen. For me, this is an absolutely central question. And I would much prefer, if AI really is a technology that boosts productivity, that it means more wealth is created for everyone. The real question, of course, that wealth will be distributed, but it's still easier to share new wealth fairly than to divide something that hasn't grown in the first place.
Very well said. As I said, it seems like there's a kind of confrontation between the United States and China when it comes to AI, or at least that's how it's being presented to us by some. We're especially thinking of JD Vance's recent speech in Paris, for instance. What do you think are the main dangers and challenges of AI from a geopolitical point of view?
I would say that I see three main ones. First of all, technology is always closely linked to the power of a country. So if a country or a group of countries manages to take a significant lead over others on artificial intelligence, it could considerably change things in relation to the balance of power in place on the global geopolitical chessboard. So, a good example of comparison is during the time of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, before the Industrial Revolution, the whole world was more or less fairly equal, and the power of the countries at equal technology depended on the size of their population, rather. But thanks to the industrial revolutions, the West, starting with England, gained a major competitive advantage over the rest of the world. Their productivity increased massively, and that's what allowed them, as we all know, to go on and conquer large parts of the world. These technologies first developed in the West, and it's also what gave Western countries the means to dominate the world for nearly 3 centuries. So, these kinds of technological shifts are never trivial, they have huge consequences. Technologies like that can really change things. So, that's the first point. Second point, one of the dangers is in terms of strategic autonomy. We could end up with an even greater form of digital colonization than today. We've seen that a lot has happened with the internet, especially in Europe, in fact. China has defended itself quite well in this regard, but Europe has really done a disastrous job around this issue, and we are back together, really digitally colonized by the United States. It's interesting. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk more about that later.
Talk about it later in more detail, but this point that you emphasize. Besides, it's not that Russia seems to have followed the same path. Moreover, in alliance on a certain number of technologies with China to have real sovereignty in these areas where European leaders, the European Union have let everything slip by a little bit and are waking up a bit hungover just now on these questions, on geopolitical questions.
Right. Yes, absolutely. It's a central topic. So happy to talk about it later. And then I think that the third danger of AI, and it's quite related to strategic autonomy, that's all that has to do with controlling information. I think we are moving towards a world, little by little, where we will obtain more and more of our information through artificial intelligence, which can be a great tool for propaganda because artificial intelligence can know you in a way where it can manipulate you, make you believe in certain things, or push certain ideas in the way that is most attractive to. In short, it can be a great tool for disseminating ideas and controlling how people think. And obviously, it's also very much a question of strategic autonomy because let's be honest, we're now in a situation in France where, as we were just saying a moment ago, we depend heavily on foreign technologies, especially American ones, for almost everything digital, from infrastructure to everyday tools. We are fairly colonized numerically by the United States. And if they also end up dominating us in the field of artificial intelligence, then they could easily shape the way our population sees the world. They could spread information or even misinformation and make people believe things that serve their own interests. An understanding of the world that is in their best interest, but not in ours. Well, that's an important issue. So I think we need to work a lot on this issue so that Europeans can maintain this autonomy over information so that we have information, a way of understanding the world that is in our own interests.
So, precisely speaking of interest, of vision of the world, of actually modeling perceptions for a very long time, actually, still today, we had a very strong influence in Europe. But on the other side, the United States also shaped minds, first through Hollywood cinema and then later through TV series. Now, I would like to discuss in more detail with you the vision of the United States in relation to artificial intelligence. And to address it, I would like to introduce with this sequence taken from J.D. Vance's speech in Paris, and which you also commented on in a very interesting way in two very remarkable tweets.
I'm not here this morning to talk about AI safety, which was the title of the conference a couple of years ago. I'm here to talk about AI opportunity. When conferences like this convene to discuss a cutting-edge technology, oftentimes I think our response is to be too self-conscious, too risk-averse. Now, our administration, the Trump administration, believes that AI will have countless revolutionary applications in economic innovation, job creation, national security, healthcare, free expression, and beyond. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to make 4 main points today. Number 1, this administration will ensure that American AI technology continues to be the gold standard worldwide, and we are the partner of choice for others, foreign countries, and certainly businesses as they expand their own use of AI. Number 2, we believe that excessive regulation of the AI sector could kill a transformative industry just as it's taking off, and we'll make every effort to encourage pro-growth AI policies, and I like to see that deregulatory flavor making its way into a lot of the conversations this conference. Number three, we feel very strongly that AI must remain free from ideological bias and that American AI will not be co-opted into a tool for authoritarian censorship. And finally, number four, the Trump administration will maintain a pro-worker growth path for AI, so it can be a potent tool for job creation in the United States. And I appreciate Prime Minister Modi's point. AI, I really believe, will facilitate and make people more productive. It is not going to replace human beings. It will never replace human beings. And I think too many of the leaders in the AI industry, when they talk about this fear of replacing workers, I think they really miss the point. AI, we believe, is going to make us more productive, more prosperous, and more free. The United States of America is the leader in AI, and our administration plans to keep it that way. The U.S. possesses all components across the full AI stack, including advanced semiconductor design, frontier algorithms, and of course, transformational applications. Now, the computing power this stack requires is integral to advancing AI technology. And to safeguard America's advantage, the Trump administration will ensure that the most powerful AI systems are built in the U.S. with American-designed and manufactured chips. Now, the development of cutting-edge AI in the U.S. is no accident. By preserving an open regulatory environment, we've encouraged American innovators to experiment and to make unparalleled R&D investments. Of the $700 billion, give or take, that's estimated to be spent on AI in 2028, over half of it will likely be invested in the United States of America. Now, with the President's recent executive order on AI, we're developing an AI action plan that avoids an overly precautionary regulatory regime while ensuring that all Americans benefit from the technology and its transformative potential. However, the Trump administration is troubled by reports that some foreign governments are considering tightening the screws on U.S. tech companies with international footprints. Now, America cannot and will not accept that, and we think it's a terrible mistake, not just for the United States of America, but for your own countries. Now, at this moment, we face the extraordinary prospect of a new industrial revolution, one on par with the invention of the steam engine or Bessemer steel. But it will never come to pass if overregulation deters innovators from taking the risks necessary to advance the ball. From CCTV to 5G equipment, we're all familiar with cheap tech in the marketplace that's been heavily subsidized and exported by authoritarian regimes. But as I know, and I think some of us in this room have learned from experience, partnering with them means chaining your nation to an authoritarian master that seeks to infiltrate, dig in, and seize your information infrastructure. Finally, this administration wants to be very clear about one last point. We will always center American workers in our AI policy. And we must focus now on the opportunity to catch lightning in a bottle, unleash our most brilliant innovators, and use AI to improve the well-being of our nations and their peoples. With great confidence, I can say it is an opportunity that the Trump administration will not squander.
So, yeah, we heard J.D. Vance loud and clear. What do you think that tells us about the American vision?
It tells us that they clearly see artificial intelligence as a geopolitical tool that they fully intend to use as a weapon to maintain a form of domination over the world. It's quite obvious. And by the way, he said it himself in his speech. He said that AI is a dangerous weapon in the wrong hands, but an incredible tool for freedom and prosperity in the right hands. That means what it means. He wants to use it as a tool for, they always say, freedom and prosperity, but it means the freedom and prosperity of the United States, especially. And he also says it, he wants American AI to dominate. The exact situation is that the United States of America is the leader in artificial intelligence, and our administration wants to maintain this position. So it's clear he really sees this as a competition, one that he wants to win. And he also says that he is ready to use every tool at the disposal of the United States to make sure he wins. Um, so he makes it clear in his speech that they will continue to restrict access to all components of the artificial intelligence chain to ensure that the most powerful artificial intelligence systems are built in the United States. And he is also very threatening. At one point in his speech, he said that it would be a terrible mistake for your countries if we tightened the screws on American tech companies. This is obviously a threat compared to his audience, which was made up of all heads of government who were there. There was Macron, there were a lot of European heads of government. It seems to me that there was Modi too. I don't know who there was from China anymore. There was one of the Chinese leaders. I don't know exactly who he was anymore. Well, that's what he announced the color. Very clearly, the United States sees this as a technological arms race, a race they absolutely want to win at all costs. They see artificial intelligence not just as a tool for progress, but as a strategic asset that can give them a strong competitive advantage over the rest of the world. It's a way for them to secure their leadership position and ensure that they continue to shape global rules and standards while maintaining a certain form of dominance on the international stage on the others. And if anyone tries to compete with them or even just tries to take a different path, they immediately see it as a threat, something that needs to be contained or pushed back. Likewise, if someone tries to enter the race and compete with them, they'll use every tool at their disposal to stop them. So, yeah, I find it quite worrying because it diverges quite dramatically from the vision of the rest of the world, especially the French vision, since there was a summit in Paris to agree on a common vision of artificial intelligence, a multilateral vision where we think together about the dangers, the common rules. And there are only two countries that did not want to sign. It was the United States and England. So it clearly shows that there is a very different vision of the United States compared to the rest of the world. And in fact, the French are perhaps closer to the Chinese vision than to the American vision.
This is not new, although we have very, very, very Atlanticist leaders. And I think that unfortunately, once again, Emmanuel Macron is taking his dreams for reality. Yeah, JD Vance's words were a stark reminder of where things really stand. So let's take a closer look at these questions of this clash, because what you are depicting is, in fact, in this new Cold War that are emerging, very widely wanted by the United States, regardless of the administrations, the reorientation of the US pivot to Asia actually started under Obama, with China clearly in the crosshairs. Then came Donald Trump, different in his speech. He is a bit punk, but well, the overall strategy is still the same. So, a form of confrontation where AI could become the new nuclear missile. In other words, you could say that whoever controls AI controls the world. So, in the face of that kind of power dynamic, the real question is, China has built a semi-closed tech ecosystem with people like Huawei, Tencent, or Alibaba. How does this strategy of controlled disconnection, so to speak, allow it to compete with the United States while limiting its dependence on Western technologies?
Well, I would say that it is precisely because it is semi-closed that they can compete with the United States. If we look closely, the only countries that have really managed to adopt this kind of approach are the ones that succeeded in building their own giants, companies capable of competing with the big American tech firms. So, from the very beginning, China actually saw the digital space as a strategic battleground, one with major sovereignty issues. And they made it a priority to regulate and control it in order to protect their own strategic autonomy, particularly when it comes to key areas like communication, for example, the flow of information, the way content is shared, and how narratives are built and spread across society. And two, also to be able to ensure that their own businesses, so that they could build companies in this field that actually have a real chance to compete with the American giants. And they played their cards very well, because if we look at today's global digital ecosystem, well, it's clear that there are really only two big players now: China and the United States, with Russia also in the game to some extent, but on a smaller scale, simply because the Russian market is much smaller than the Chinese one.
There's also India, which is slowly but steadily emerging on the scene with a huge and very specific market of its own.
India, yes, but they haven't really created digital giants, in fact, because they have a few big businesses around e-commerce, but otherwise they really don't have much. Precisely because they kept this approach quite open. In fact, a bit like us Europeans, and they were colonized in quotation marks in the digital field. All Indians are on Facebook. All Indians use US platforms, American social networks, and all that.
And so, in this rivalry, when we talk about AI, we're also talking about semiconductors, we're talking about microchips.
But here too, there is a very clear clash. Moreover, the tensions around Taiwan are very, very linked to this issue. We saw how brutally the United States could manage the issue without it being Trump again, that it was under the Biden administration. And there were also American sanctions, of course, like the ones targeting SMIC or Huawei, for example. Is China able to accelerate its autonomy, semiconductors, or could it have a problem compared to the United States on next generation chips? Does the United States have an advantage at the moment?
For the moment, yes, they still have an advantage. They are still ahead of semiconductors. Um, but I think that their strategy, in fact, over the long term, is going to eat away at this advantage more quickly than if they had not put this export conqueror strategy in place. Let me explain myself. For example, if you look at a company like NVIDIA or Intel and all, Intel, they made an absolutely huge part of their income from China by value. China imported more semiconductors than oil. So it's still absolutely huge. I don't know the exact number anymore, but I think it was nearly $1 trillion worth of semiconductors every year. I think it was 800 billion or something like that. An absolutely gigantic figure. What?
Yeah, that's an absolutely
Yes,
massive
absolutely.
number.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. It was a financial windfall for those companies, giving them the means to invest massively in research and development to push forward and create the next generations of semiconductors and everything else that comes with it. But then the Biden administration came in with new rules, basically saying, we don't want you selling the latest generations of semiconductors to China anymore, precisely because of artificial intelligence, since that would help them become more competitive, strengthen their technological capabilities, and potentially challenge US dominance in this highly strategic field. Um, in the same way as us on artificial intelligence, what we don't want, we want have the best chips to be able to develop on most advanced AI technologies faster. But of course, China's response to all this has been to go all in and building its own domestic semiconductor ecosystem to make up for this gap. And they're pouring absolutely massive amounts of money into it, huge investments. And let's be honest, they will succeed. The Chinese are, anyway, incredibly determined and methodical when it comes to achieving this kind of strategic. The Chinese people are quite intelligent. They have a history that says a lot about their capabilities. Well, it's the kind of thing they know how to what they have, what they more PhDs, more engineers, more scientists than the United States and Europe combined. So it's a problem that they're going to be late for maybe a few more years, but in the end, they will catch up with the United States. And what will happen then? It's because these companies, Nvidia, Intel, all that will end up with Chinese competitors. They'll probably get there even faster than if the market had remained open, and now, and Chinese competitors who will have very significant and well-funded research and development capabilities, since they have captured the Chinese market, which is the world's largest consumer market for semiconductors. So yeah, I think it's more like a policy where they shot themselves in the foot. The scenario where it can make sense for the United States is if China fails to catch up, and indeed, this is causing a significant delay for China in terms of artificial intelligence, at least for the next 2 or 3 years. And if in the meantime, the United States manages to develop AI models that really shift the balance in global business, then they could create a kind of technological leap, something that triggers a virtuous cycle and allows them to move ahead even further, much faster, and potentially leave China far behind. But honestly, that's a lot of ifs. Because what we've seen, for example, with DeepSeek is that even with all the export restrictions and all the barriers put in place, China is still more or less operating at the same level as the United States when it comes to artificial intelligence. So in the end, I think the real impact of these policies is relatively limited, or at least not as decisive as some in Washington might have hoped. There are a few probabilities.
Exactly. I was going to say the same, even if it's a bit redundant. It's really interesting what you're saying because it opens up a lot of important questions. First of all, from a broader geopolitical perspective, your point is absolutely crucial. It's the issue of sanctions and the overuse of sanctions during this period of American hegemony, the one that followed the fall of the Soviet Union. At one point, it worked, it was convenient, even effective in some cases. But now it's clearly destructive, or even, as you say, it makes the West, and specifically the United States, if they shoot themselves in the foot, think, among other things, of the freezing of Russian assets, which makes many countries think that maybe we will switch to the BRICS platforms to avoid having all our eggs stuck in the same place. And therefore, de facto, it is reducing the inflow of the dollar little by little, even if there are still some very far away. So to continue with AI, you just talked about DeepSeek. We know we have OpenAI, DeepMind, and other Western companies that still dominate the mainstream AI model. But in fact, very quickly, we saw a rival. You talked about NVIDIA. We saw DeepSeek arrive, which surprised absolutely everyone, with apparently developed with not too many resources. So right away, the Chinese were blamed. Oh, they stole that. That's Donald Trump. The Chinese stole the technology. I don't know where, but they stole it. So can China catch up? Because we saw NVIDIA collapse on the stock market. Can she catch up? Is it profitable on models like every GPT, Jimmy, or Claude? Is that for you, as far as I understand, the Chinese can really compete with the Americans and they will have a hard time slowing it down.
So what DeepSeek has shown is that not only can they catch up with them, but they have caught up with them, since DeepSeek is only the second model, reasoning model, as we say, reasoning model. I don't know how to translate that exactly into French, which was launched shortly after OpenAI. Actually, it's a very recent development, introduced just 2 months ago, and it already shows how fast things are moving in the AI field. So that means that on a lot of benchmarks, DeepSeek's was even better. So that means they are on the same level. In fact, that's it. So on DeepSeek, for example, the investor Mark Andreessen, who is the founder of the browser, he is the one who invented the internet browser, and the founder of Andreessen Horowitz, who is the VC, the most famous, the most legendary investor in Silicon Valley. He wrote in a tweet. So, yes, he mentioned, as we saw, that DeepSeek is one of the most amazing and impressive advances he has ever had in his career. And it acts as open source software. It's an amazing gift to the world, because that's the big difference between DeepSeek and the OpenAI model, which is, contrary to the name, not open. It's a closed model. Nobody knows the details. DeepSeek offered its model to the world. It's open source. Anyone can use it for free. So it's a vision.
I just want to point out how important what you just said is, again, because a lot of people haven't really realized it, but some are already saying it's because the Chinese are extremely sneaky, that they've moved it open source for some hidden reason. Like it's all part of a plan to dominate us even more.
No, I think this has often been compared to the Sputnik moment, when the Russians launched Sputnik, that small satellite, the first one ever sent into space. It triggered an arms race because people realized the Russians were ahead of us. So the United States responded by massively investing in space technologies and everything that went with it.
But the fundamental difference with Sputnik is that, unlike the Russians back then, the Chinese are actually offering offering technology the world. So it's actually a way of stopping an arms race by saying, here we have developed a new weapon in this arms race. Now here we are offering it to now here we are offering it to the world. You can use it too. Anyone can use it. We have a vision of democratization of artificial intelligence where everyone has equal access to it. So even if, for example, you are in Africa, let's say you can use the DeepSeek model if you want to create something around artificial intelligence for free what? And it is also a way of cutting the grass under the foot of American giants. It is destroying American strategy, in fact. To dominate artificial intelligence by having these closed models, where we just we don't know exactly what the technology behind it is, and at the same time they're still charging quite a lot to use it. It cuts the grass under their feet by saying, well, no, we developed it for free and we are offering it to you. So yeah, it's a fundamentally different vision of artificial intelligence. And as I said earlier, closer to the French vision, because we too have a fairly well-known AI company, which is Mistral, which also does open source. So yeah, it's a vision where AI is going to be like a fundamental technology, like electricity, for example, where everyone should have access to it. What will matter is what we will build with it, but the technology itself should not be monopolized by one country or the other. Everyone should have access to it, just as everyone has access to electricity or water. It should be a common good.
So, on the issue of AI, there are a lot of fears in the West about China. You have to tell us whether they are founded or not founded. It is in the use model of this AI. People often say that China is using AI to carry out large scale mass surveillance. But is that criticism really fair? And even if it's true, is it really that specific to China? Because let's not forget, the United States has been doing mass surveillance for a long time already. Just think of the NSA's Echelon program, which was monitoring pretty much every email and phone exchange imaginable. It's also said that China could use artificial intelligence for military operations or warfare related purposes. Is it true, or is it just the pot calling the kettle black? Because let's be honest,
The Americans are obviously doing it too. Many of us already suspected it. And now, thanks to what came out during the Trump administration, we know for sure they really are.
So, lo and behold, what about China on this subject?
So, first of all, to talk about the whole issue of information and propaganda, I think there were a lot of people who emphasized the fact that DeepSeek, when asked about Tiananmen, entrepreneurial or sensitive Chinese political topics, it simply didn't provide any answer. Indeed, that's exactly what happens when you access DeepSeek through the official deepseek.com website, I believe, because it's hosted in China, and since there are specific laws in China regarding that kind of content. But again, it's open source, so anyone can download the model hosted in France or anywhere else, and then modify it according to your needs, your goals, or even your personal preferences. So, for instance, if someone wanted to completely transform DeepSeek into an anti-China propaganda tool, let's say a version of the model that only talks about Tiananmen and constantly pushes a certain narrative, well, that's entirely possible. DeepSeek is released under the MIT license, which is actually the most permissive license you can get. That means there are virtually no restrictions. You can take the model, modify it, redistribute it, use it commercially. You can basically do whatever you want with it. So yeah, that's the reality. This way of proceeding is still much less worrying than the American approach, where everything relies on closed models. There is absolutely no possibility to change the model in that direction. The model has a particular narrative around certain questions. And besides, it's quite clear. Ask him questions in relation to different, say, election candidates. The answers are going to be quite biased. There's been a lot of discussion and content shared about this. And the reality is, there's no real way for users to remove or correct the bias themselves. The only ones who can actually change that are OpenAI, since they're the ones who control and train the model. So it's a lot less open and a lot less libertarian, paradoxically. Only the Chinese way of doing things. Afterwards, you asked me questions on the subject of mass surveillance. There are still a lot of myths and misconceptions surrounding this in China. There's still a lot of misinformation going around. It's not the nightmarish place it's often portrayed to be, where people are under surveillance all day long. For example, there is this myth that there is a social credit system that has been widely disseminated. Even the French German TV channel Arte, I think, had done a whole program about it at one point. It doesn't exist. It's just a myth. There is no social credit system in.
It's fascinating.
Also,
It's fascinating. It's great. It's honestly really interesting because we have all these completely crazy myths about Africa, about Russia. And then what you're telling us is basically that it's all nonsense.
yes, it's a complete myth. It just doesn't exist. You go to China, you ask people, what's your social credit score? And they look at you with wide eyes. Nobody's ever heard of it. It simply doesn't exist.
So wait, Chinese people aren't walking around with a little scorecard on their phone, getting good points whenever they do something right? No scorecard, nothing like that?
And actually, in that Arte documentary, I don't know if they misunderstood or if it was just plain dishonest. They showed a phone screen with points, but it was actually just the Alibaba app. It was their internal rating system, like what you get as a driver or a passenger on Uber or something along those lines. So it had absolutely nothing to do with a social credit system or anything like that. It was just Alibaba's user rating score to see if you behave well as a seller or as a customer on the platform. So no, that system doesn't exist. There are definitely a lot of myths out there. And yes, it's true. There are a lot of surveillance cameras in China, but that's not something unique to China. It's the same in many other countries. For example, I personally lived in London for 4 or 5 years, and honestly, there are cameras absolutely everywhere in the city. It's the same logic. The goal is simply to be able to track down and identify suspects more quickly if a crime happens. It's not about monitoring every citizen's daily. It's not something that's so specific to China. You see this kind of thing pretty much everywhere. So, yes, it's really important to make a clear distinction between myth and reality. Now, of course, the real question is whether China is going to pair artificial intelligence with its camera systems to track down or apprehend certain individuals more quickly. Yes, without a doubt. In fact, maybe they are already doing it. But again, it's something you can be for, you can be against. I think it's going to be pretty generalized, actually, that kind of stuff. Um, uh, so I'm not.
especially since on the collection, especially since the suspicion of data collection, it'll movie of well, the Americans aren't exactly in a position to criticize. It's often funny, actually, because this kind of concern or criticism is really just a mirror image of what the United States is already doing.
Exactly. And I think the key point here is that in China, it's the Chinese government that's doing all of this. It's their own government operating within their own country. Whereas in our case, it's not our government doing it, it's the American government. So once again, we're facing a serious sovereignty issue. Our data isn't going to Macron or the French administration. It's going straight to servers owned and operated by US tech giants. And the truth is, we have very little idea of what's really being done with that data or how it might be used in the future. And so honestly, I think we should be much more concerned about that situation, about what is happening with our own data, rather than constantly worrying about what the Chinese government is doing with data on its own population. Well, it's from a strategic point of view, from a sovereignty point of view. Um, and in that regard, they're in a much better position than we are.
So before addressing the situation in Europe, this is what you care about AI. Just a few quick questions like that on the future innovations and prospects for China in this field. First, a question about the intelligence, the way in which all this was developed, because in the West, there is a lot of blame on China, even officially with Donald Trump, like Russia, by the way. And all of this new technology has been stolen. They are spies. Donald Trump said it for AI and said it for the Russians for hypersonic missiles. The Russians have hypersonic missiles because they stole them. One wonders why the Americans didn't steal the plans. You can't stop making your own hypersonic missiles. That's for logic. But we can see precisely from afar, like me, there seems to be a lot of technological breakthroughs coming from China. Moreover, often by selling them, they are quite astonishing to catch them. I can't even understand it. My scientific level is starting to be very, very delayed. Uh, it captures solar energy and sends it by microwave to Earth. The nuclear fusion reactor that lasted almost 18 minutes contained in its magnetic chamber. Space lasers. While it seems to be more of an explosion of technology, or maybe they're just stealing everything, I don't know, somewhere in the US.
So, yes, there was a time when China was clearly far behind in terms of technology, as everyone knows, and they had a catch up strategy, a way to close the gap. And honestly, this whole narrative about them stealing everything is really exaggerated. In reality, their strategy was pretty straightforward. They would simply say to companies, if you want access to the Chinese market, you have to transfer some of your know how. And they did that with French companies too. For example, in the nuclear sector. We're the ones who built their first nuclear power plant in Guangdong province. Same thing with trains. We built trains in China. We built, the Chinese would always say, we're offering you access to the Chinese market. You can sell here, but it has to be through a joint venture with technology transfer. So it wasn't theft, it was a voluntary agreement. The companies signed the deals, they agreed to the terms. And honestly, it's a fairly common practice in many developing countries.
And actually, you can really see how the story has completely flipped. Recently, it was the European Commission through Ursula von der Leyen who said, well, if Chinese battery factories are set up in Europe, there should be technology transfers. What a reversal. What a complete turnaround.
Yes, indeed, what a striking reversal. And I think that's exactly what Europe should be doing. It's what China did to grow and catch up over the past few decades. Now that they're ahead of us in several key technologies like batteries and electric cars, there's no reason we shouldn't do the same. We should offer them access to the European market, let them sell here, but in return, ask them to teach us how to build and produce these technologies ourselves. That would be a smart, strategic, and forward looking policy. And if they agree, then it's voluntary. And in the end, everyone benefits.
It just requires having a little less hubris.
Yeah,
Well, it's a bit
yeah,
more
sure.
complicated than that. This is the hardest part.
Yeah, yeah, sure. And just to mention how far ahead China really is, there's actually an Australian think tank, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, that conducted a study. They identified 64 critical future technologies, the ones that will shape the world in the coming years, and compared China's lead in each of them. Especially when you compare it to the United States, China is ranked first in 59 out of those 64 future technologies identified in the study, which is absolutely incredible when you think about it. The United States, by contrast, comes out on top in only 5 of them, and Europe, unfortunately, is lagging far behind in almost all areas. So clearly, China is no longer in a phase of catching up, and certainly not in a phase of stealing, as some people still like to claim. On the contrary, they've taken the lead in most of these strategic technologies, and now it's actually us, Europe, the West, who have to catch up with them, not the other way around.
In terms of innovations, Shenzhen has become the world's new tech workshop thanks to ultra fast supply chains, fab labs, and dark factories. How does the model differ from Silicon Valley?
In fact, precisely, I think the model is that it is not concentrated in Shenzhen. China has an approach that some people call the best economy, where basically there is extreme competition in China between provinces. That's another myth about China. We still have this image of China because it is a communist country, an ultra centralized country. But in fact, it's an ultra decentralized country where the provinces, because China is divided into 34 provinces, would have a lot of autonomy, especially in the economic field, the field of innovation where they can do they can do full of experiments and where they are in competition with each other. So when China says that it is necessary to develop on a certain product, a certain technology, they are setting up their best team system, and each province is trying to develop their own champions around this technology. Um, and that's why, for example, on the toilet seat, there were 500 of electric car companies in China. Each province had its own. Now, of course, some provinces are doing better than others. Some provinces are richer, bigger than others. Shenzhen, which is the province of Guangdong, is an example of one of the richest provinces in China by far. They managed to develop more champions than others. But there are tech companies emerging that no one in the West has ever heard of deep in China. Well, that's the secret of China, in fact.
Speaking of which, there is a war for talent, a war for brains for a long time. China, Russia, India have expatriated Iran, have expatriated many of their engineers, especially to the United States. It was even a model of technological development for the United States to the point where in a rather confusing way for several years. Those who win international mathematics competitions when they are the United States are a team entirely composed of Chinese, good, not necessarily Americans, but well, that obviously Chinese. Is that how is it that now it seems that there is a backwards movement that is taking place? If I understood correctly, last year, 20,000 Chinese scientists left the United States either to settle in China when they were born in the United States or to return to China by having been trained in China. How does China organize, or these very decentralized say that it is very decentralized universities, companies? How do they repatriate their graduates or even look for graduates, engineers from other countries, including Western ones?
So already, historically, in fact, most of the graduates were already returning to China. 80% of Chinese students who studied in the United States historically returned to China after their studies. This also shows that China is not necessarily that nightmarish state where people absolutely want to leave. In fact, most were returning completely of their own free will because, quite simply, there are more opportunities for them in China, which is growing much faster than the United States. And then, in fact, over the last few years, there is a movement of scientists of Chinese origin in the United States who are returning to China, in particular because of an initiative by the FBI in the United States, something called the China Initiative, which had an absolutely disastrous effect in the sense that basically they started suspecting everyone, especially scientists and researchers of Chinese origin, of spying or espionage. It created an atmosphere of mistrust and paranoia that ended up having absolutely disastrous consequences. It's as simple as that. And there were hundreds of investigations. I think something like 99% of it was based on absolutely nothing, but it had the effect of putting a huge chill on scientists of Chinese origin who felt stigmatized in the United States. There have even been suicides, I think. There are some who have, there you go, they had to spend incredible lawyer fees to defend themselves when they had nothing to blame themselves for. Finally, there have been some quite really sad cases. And so what happened next was a whole wave of people moving back to China, when, for the most part, they had no intention of doing so. They participated in American scientific developments. Um, Another story where the United States shot itself in the foot because of its McCarthyite tendency. Um,
Very, very interesting. We know that the population in China is aging, which is the case almost everywhere in the world, of course, in the West. Can China maintain its leadership in robotics and AI without rethinking its social model? And is it maybe China is not aiming, a bit like in Japan, to maybe take care of their elders thanks to AI and robotics?
so that's a good question. It's hard to say. Yeah, finally, a good question. All your questions were great. There are a lot of initiatives in China around encouraging people to have more children. For example, today, China doesn't limit family size anymore. People can have as many kids as they want. But despite lifting these restrictions, many Chinese families are still hesitant to have more children simply because raising children involves huge costs, particularly around education, because in China, education is practically a religion. Officially, school is free, sure, but in reality, every single family spends enormous amounts of money hiring private tutors and paying for extra classes after school.
And do you know what the birth rate is now? Do you have the latest figures?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I think it's around 1.2. I don't really remember exactly. But anyway, that's well below the replacement rate. It's not the lowest though. South Korea is way lower. I think they're at something like 0.7, or 0.8. But yeah, it's low. For example, they made an initiative where they completely banned the entire tutoring industry to make sure that there was no longer this kind of unhealthy competition where, in addition to school, all children had to be ready to take private lessons. It ruined the parents, and it's also not great for children's development. So, yeah, we really feel that this is a problem that concerns the Chinese government. However, there are not many examples of countries that have succeeded in reversing a low birth rate. Is China going to get there? I don't know. Or are they going to have to adapt? It's more likely, I think. Uh, well, it's not like South Korea, where it's a small country, therefore they can quickly become extinct. China, they have 1.4 billion people. And then there was a kind of baby boom 10 or 20 years ago. So the active population will still remain very large and even increase, if I'm not mistaken, in the years to come. So it's not an imminent and super worrying problem either, but it is clearly a problem that they are going to have to face.
Let me come back to my question, because outside of the so-called problems, since things are always presented as problems, we're still stuck thinking in the categories of the previous wars. It's an old adage I take from military school, but we're a bit when we see the progress of robotics and AI, we can even, contrary to the idea that it can be a brake on the economy, we can imagine, and that's my question, would there not be systems under development where AIs or robots would take care of the elderly, which obviously requires a colossal production of thought, machine interaction, how to help on a daily basis, the reversal of Tamagotchi, those who took care of the little Tamagotchis as children. Well, there are big Tamagotchis who take care of them when they are adults.
Yes, I have absolutely no doubt about that. It will happen. And on top of that, China already has the leading companies in everything related to the development of humanoid robots, which at some point will inevitably be combined with artificial intelligence, or more precisely, with large language models like DeepSeek. And that's going to give them language will allow real interaction and communication with them. So we're really heading toward a world where I don't know what horizon 5, 10, 15, 20 years, where we will have humanoid robots that will be as manually skilled as humans and as intelligent as humans. Different intelligence, but they will understand everything they are told. They will be able to have a conversation with us, and they will be able to do most of the tasks that humans do. And so they will actually be able to take care of the elderly, take care of the children, take care of the household at home. Well, that's what. And I said once on Twitter that I think the humanoid robot market will be the first revolutionary consumer product, where it will be China that will really launch the flagship product before the United States, because they are really ahead of the curve. There are clubs like Unity, for example, where we look at their robots. They are really 1 to 2 generations ahead of the United States. What? So I think it wouldn't surprise me at all if the equivalent of the iPhone, of what the iPhone was for cell phones, should put the Chinese launch for humanoid robots.
And I will have a lot of questions about nuclear power, green energy, but maybe we'll do that another time.
Let's get back to our topic of the day. Maybe just a quick word about Europe, because as we said earlier, Europe is clearly behind. What is clearly behind? We had this. There was even that interview with Macron on CNN where he said very clearly to Trump, "Your number one problem is China, and you should really focus on that before anything else." A statement that fits perfectly with the Atlantis posture he's always had, aligning closely with the American geopolitical agenda, almost as if it were second nature. So there you have it, a little excerpt from Macron giving his advice to Donald. What do you think, and what would be a better European AI strategy? Can we finally get out of it?
Already, I thought that what Macron said reflected an absolutely terrifying short term vision. Already, when he says that, of course, France will not like it. China, and I don't think it's particularly smart in the current geopolitical context when it's the only major player with which Europe could collaborate to have levers against the United States in relation to this issue of customs fees, in relation to artificial intelligence, all that. So, on artificial intelligence specifically, we seem to have, as we said earlier, a vision relatively similar to that of a vision relatively similar to that of a vision that is relatively similar to that of China. They're saying we want to democratize artificial intelligence. We believe in open source, and we both, France, Europe, and China, want to resist digital colonization by the United States. We want to maintain our sovereignty in this field. The Chinese even signed the final communique of the AI summit in Paris. The Americans didn't. So, in that context, why would we side with the US and start pointing fingers at China rather than asking ourselves of why the Americans are targeting us just as much? Excuse me the expression, but it's really stupid. On the contrary, the intelligent approach is on subjects on which we agree with the Chinese, such as AI, to create a form of coalition with them to weigh more heavily against the United States. For me, it's common sense.
While the Americans have been beating up Europeans quite severely in recent years and even very actively on the relocation of our industry to the United States,
Disunited, we are always weaker. So, on subjects on which we agree, why not unite? I'm not talking about an alliance like there is an alliance in NATO or anything, but I'm just talking about a form of coalition on specific issues on which we agree in order to be able to weigh more heavily compared to the United States. It's an approach strategically that makes sense rather than deliberately dividing ourselves with the Chinese like Macron does. I don't understand.
It's a very BRICS approach, extremely de Gaulle like.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
just to stay on this subject, we actually did a short report recently on Fréquence Populaire about Switzerland, which of course isn't the most powerful or most populated country in Europe. And yet they're the first in Europe to say maybe it would be a good idea to have sovereign data storage. It's not full sovereignty, of course, but still they're taking steps toward greater technological independence in this area. So if you could go see our geniuses who are in Brussels and Paris, what would you tell them? Come on, guys, you have to do one, two, three to start catching up. So we saw collaborating, working with China, a bit like they themselves did. I think it seemed to me it's a good idea what you already said earlier. Bring in Chinese companies with technology sharing. We open the market, but in return, we have the technology, and then little by little, by working, we catch up with it. What else would you suggest?
Already, I think that there is a subject energy that is important and very important for artificial intelligence. Moreover, Macron himself recognized this during the summit with his slightly odd little sentence, plug baby plug, as opposed to Trump's drill baby drill, where I think he meant that Europe has electricity that works and that all you have to do is put the equipment in the socket. But I checked, and electricity in Europe is on average 70% more expensive than in the United States. And we produce half as much per inhabitant as, and I don't even compare with China, where electricity is 3 times cheaper than the United States.
In fact, if we used our nuclear power that they have addressed a lot during the 25 years, would be cheaper than that of the United States. But as it is indexed to the end of the E and the pricing is gas. And then the situation with Russia, obviously, the prices are completely absurd.
There is all that. And then also, quite simply, we produce not enough electricity. What do we really have to do? A lot of work to produce more. We have more inhabitants in the United States. We are 400 million, F330, and we produce 25% less electricity than. So it's still it's still weird. What's the matter? What's weird? So what? So we're really late, and that's going to count a lot for artificial intelligence, since it's based a lot on what we call compute. So it's these data center, data processing center, where the hell is artificial intelligence, very energy intensive. So a lot of work should be done around that. Second, talent. I think we need to have an approach a bit like China that would bring her talents closer to home. We have a lot of talent in artificial intelligence. Some of the fathers of artificial intelligence are French, such as Yann LeCun, for example. And he works for Facebook in the United States. A bit of a shame, anyway. So you would have to, would set up a program to repatriate talents, train new talents, and pay them well to ensure that France, Europe is attractive around all this. And I think that what's most important, in my opinion, it means we need to reform the way our leaders think, to reshape their mindset around the question of sovereignty. And honestly, I think that's probably the most important thing right now. As they say in English, I preach to the choir, I'm preaching. Yes, I'm preaching. That's it, I'm preaching.
A lot of preaching about it because, frankly, that's the base. Otherwise,
There you go. There you go. Because we lost. We had it under the goal, but we have really lost this mentality where we have a sovereignty that must be defended. We must think about French interests, European interests, to defend our people, our peoples, our businesses in an intelligent way, not in a way that is hostile to others. China has never been hostile to us, for example, or to the United States. On the contrary, they invited us to come to their home, but in such a way that it was in line with their own interests. Our leaders need to start thinking about these issues instead of being Atlanticists by default, where submission to the United States has become the cardinal principle. And that's exactly what brought us to the situation we're in today.
and finally, just a subsidiary question, one that could actually open the door to broader discussions later on. As it happens, today marks the opening of the Munich Security Conference, taking place, of course, in Munich, where in 2007, Putin gave a speech which remained famous and which said a lot about the evolution of the BRICS, about the war in Ukraine. And precisely, the situation is evolving. The situation, well, things are changing very rapidly at the moment concerning Ukraine, especially on the United States side, who
renounced Ukraine's membership in NATO, even though that was in some ways the cause of the conflict, even though they encouraged her for 17 years. So basically, they're telling the Europeans, look, if you want to send your troops to Ukraine, go ahead, but it won't be under the NATO flag. And if anything goes wrong with Russia, there won't be any Article 5. So there you have it. Get by with all this. Do you have a quick comment on this before we leave?
Already, I think it's the right thing to do, but I also find it really unfortunate that it's the United States taking this kind of initiative instead of us Europeans, when in reality we're the ones who have the most to gain from this war coming to an end. It has already done a lot of damage to Europe, especially when it comes to energy issues, as we just discussed. And also in terms of the broader future of Eurasia, because now we're facing a situation where everything is being reshaped and Europe risks finding itself increasingly isolated in the long run. Eurasia, which is our great continent, is now somewhat divided. And that's actually very damaging for us because when we're divided, we're much weaker than when we stand united. That's why, from the very beginning, I've been advocating for this, saying that it was this attitude, this mentality of the Cold War, of the extension of NATO pushed by the United States that led to this antagonism and this conflict. And we Europeans should have put the brakes on it, since we are, in the end, the first victims, with, of course, Ukraine and Russia. But strangely enough, the United States is doing it because I imagine that it has come to an end. They divided Europe, they pitted Russia and Europe against each other. They have weakened almost everyone else walks away without too many scars. The jobs done, the war is over. And in the end, it's us who will apparently end up paying for Ukraine. So it's really quite absurd when you think about it. The On the one hand, it is good that it is ending, but it is not ending in the best way for us Europeans, because we thought in a very unstrategic and very unsovereign way.
Thank you, Arnaud. In fact, you conclude very, very well. We are thinking in a very unstrategic and very unsovereign way in the geopolitical field as in AI. Really, it is time to get our act together. In any case, thank you very much for these insights. It was really very, very interesting. A lot of information and with an original approach. I think it will be very much appreciated. And precisely, if you like this video, well, do not hesitate to like and subscribe, of course, on YouTube and also on our various social networks. Do not forget to comment, make proposals for questions, because if everything goes well and well, Arnaud, you will be with us again from here.
The honor was all mine. Thanks to you.